Hi everyone, this is Mindy Eggen for Scrapbook and Cards Today magazine, and today I'm going to be creating a project with the Altenew Fresh Dye inks. These inks that I'm going to be using are a new design by Altenew. You can see right here that they are a circular design for the ink pad. Now they have 3 different color combinations available right now. There's the Blue Mountains, Frosted Foliage, and Woodland Escape. So they are twist-off tops, and on the bottom they have the colors and names listed. And they are available in the 4 different shades that Altenew is famous for having for their layering. They have a felt pad, just like their previous inks do. And the round design of the ink pad fits nicely in the palm of your hand. The twist-off tops also make it real easy to get these on and off. I'm going to be using one of my favorite sets from Altenew, and that is the Gracious Peonies set. Now there is a stamp set, a coordinating die, and also a layering stencil, which is one of the reasons I also chose this because I want to be able to ink blend with these colors. In Altenew's packaging, they always provide inspiration for you. So this is the inspiration packet using their stamp set. So when you open it up, it's going to give you card ideas, color combinations, arrangements, and then they also list the colors that they used. So it's a great starting point for you. They also have one of these for the stencil. So inside of that inspiration sheet, you can see where they step out each individual stencil. This particular stencil has 4 layers to the flower and 1 layer for the leaves. On the stencils themselves, it'll say on there which layer it is. They have them lettered, and I sometimes will just kind of briefly go through them and take a look, and sometimes I kind of rearrange them myself. For example, in this one, the last layer of the flower is on the bottom, but I'm going to switch that around and do my leaves last. I'm going to start off my project by stamping that beautiful large image of the Gracious Peonies. So I have that loaded onto my Misty, and I'm going to ink it up with a light gray ink. This is limestone ink from Altenew. It's one of my go-to ways to do ink blending. You can certainly stamp it in black right away if you prefer, but I always like to start with a light color first because if I prefer how it looks as maybe a no-line look, I can leave it as is, or come back and stamp the image over the top with a black ink. I stamped that down once, and I'm going to stamp it one more time just to make sure I have all the flower petals and everything covered, and then I'm going to leave that stamp in my Misty tool as is. To do my ink blending, I'm going to start with the first stencil, and I'm going to use my magnetic platform to hold my stencil down over my image. Now you'll notice there that on the bottom there were pieces of the leaves sticking out, and I'm just going to mask that off with some Post-it tape, or you can use Post-it notes so I don't get any of that blue color on the leaves. I'm going to start my first color with one of the lightest colors, and this one is Water Hyacinth. I'm going to also be using the large blending tools from Altenew. These are one of my favorite brushes to use to cover large areas like this. So I'm going to pick up some of that ink and then just blend that over the open areas of the stencil. Now I am using a fairly light hand, which means I'm not putting a lot of pressure down. This is going to ensure that I'm giving this just a light dusting of ink over those open areas. Then I'm going to bring in the second layer of the stencil, and these are pretty easy to line up. So once I have that lined up over the lined images of the stamp, I'm going to use that exact same color, the Water Hyacinth, except this time I'm going to apply more ink over the top. So I'm going over it multiple times, and I'm applying a little bit more pressure. So this is just to show you that you can really stretch your ink pads, even though they come as in a 4 set, or you can purchase individually. You can really stretch them just by depending how much pressure you're adding to your ink blending or how many times you're going over that color. Now I'm bringing in the third layer of the stencil. Once again, I'm going to bring in that Post-it tape just to protect those outer areas of the image in case I overblend. And this time I'm going to bring in Alpine Aster. So this is a little bit darker of a color. I'm going to use that large blending brush once again to pick up my ink and blend that over the open areas of the stencil. Now, while I'm using these for ink blending purposes, these also are perfect for your stamp layering images as well. I'll remove this layer of the stencil and bring in the last layer of the stencil for the flowers, and I'm going to be using Crystal Violet. Now this is the last layer, but I'm going to step it up a little bit. So I'm starting once again with that large blending brush, and I'm applying the ink over the open areas. But what I want to do is kind of amp up those areas just a little bit. I almost forgot to mask off those bottom pieces. This is a really dark ink, and I definitely don't want to get that on my lines that are exposed at the bottom. So now here I'm going to bring in Indigo Skies, and this is the darkest color out of this Blue Mountains set. I'm going to be using a small blending tool, and I'm going to add this dark ink kind of right in the center of the flowers. Some of them may be on the edge, but this is just going to help it almost look like you had another layer of a stencil when you really didn't. You just are applying a darker color. Once I'm happy with that color, I can remove this layer of the stencil, and then I'm going to move on to working on the leaves. Now for the leaves, there is only one layer to it. So this kind of two-tone ink blending that I'm going to do is really going to come in handy for something like this. I'm going to start off with some jade ink. Now I think this is the second lightest color in the set. Totally up to you which color you want to make your leaves. For this, I'm using the small blending brushes to add that color. But then once again, I'm going to kind of pump up the design a little bit by adding some darker color. And for this, I'm going to jump all the way to the darkest color, and that is Forest Fern. Now for this, I like to use the Altenew mini ink blending brushes. They have a few different sizes, and they all serve a different purpose. So I do have quite a few of them in my stash. Now with this darker color, I'm adding it kind of closest to where the flower and the leaves meet, and then also towards the bottom of the leaf, just to give the illusion of a shadow. If you really wanted to step this up, you could come in with maybe a really dark blue or even black and add that to the very, very edges to almost make it look like there's 3 different layers to it. Once I have all the ink blending complete, you can leave this as is and have that no line look, or we can bring it back to the Misty stamping tool since our image is still in the exact same place, and I'm going to actually stamp back over this with some black ink. I'm just double checking to make sure that nothing had shifted, and then I'm going to stamp it in some VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. So the VersaFine Clair ink is a really good ink if you want to stamp over an ink blended background or even your ink blended images. It is an ink that stays wet a little bit longer than normal. So it is great for heat embossing if you maybe wanted to sprinkle on some clear or sparkle embossing powder, but I am just going to leave it as an outline for my image. Now, this is also an ink that does really well just stamping it down once, but I am going to kind of go over it with my heat tool and make sure this is dry before I die cut it so it doesn't transfer any ink to my die cutting plates. I lined up the coordinating die over the image, and I'm holding that down with the Altenew satin masking tape, which is a really good tape for holding your dies in place or holding your stencils in place too. And while I was die cutting, I went ahead and die cut another piece out of some plain white cardstock. The cardstock I'm using is 80 pound, so I like to add a plain one behind it just to add stability. And I used my Gina K Designs Connect glue that I keep in these fine tip bottles to add that liquid glue over the entire area. And it also allows me a little wiggle room to make sure that everything is lined up. For my sentiment, I'm using one of my favorite greeting sets, and this is the Versatile Greetings set. There is a die set with a shadow layer, and there's also a hot foil plate. I'm just going to be using the die for right now that says hey, and I have a smaller sentiment picked out from the Gracious Peonies stamp set. I'm going to just stamp this on white cardstock using some black ink. I am really a fan of having a die cut word with a smaller sentiment underneath. So I have my white cardstock. It's actually some scratch paper left over from die cutting out my image and stamping down "You are awesome." And then I'm going to trim this out with a mini paper trimmer. I'm going to be adding some dimension to my card, just a little bit, not a lot, and I love using the Altenew foam tape for this, so I'm lining the back of my image with that foam tape. Then I can remove the backing, and I'm going to add this to a card front that I created that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I really tried to include as much of the image on the front of this card as possible. It would also be a good image for a 5 by 7 card. Once I have that adhered down, I'm going to flip it over and trim off any excess that might be hanging, which thankfully is just a little bit of the leaves. The Hey sentiment off of the Versatile Greetings set, I die cut 2 times out of white cardstock and once from some brushed gold cardstock, and I'm going to layer those together to add a little bit of dimension to them. And when I had trimmed out my smaller sentiment, I also trimmed out a few extra scratch pieces, and I'm going to layer my skinny sentiment together as well. To attach these to the front of my card, I'm going to add some liquid glue behind my die cut sentiment. Now, for the most part, this is a smaller die cut word, so it's going to fit over that stamped image pretty good. Now, for my smaller sentiment, that one is going to overhang off of the image just a bit, which, remember, I added foam tape to the back of it, so there's a little bit of a lift. So what I'm doing is I'm just trimming down a foam square and adding it to one end, and then I'm adding liquid glue to the other side, and I can place this right underneath my die cut sentiment. So everything should be flush with my image. To add a little bit of bling, I'm going to use these clear dewdrops from Concord and Ninth. So I'm adding a few down below and a few above my sentiment to help maybe draw your eye into that sentiment a little bit. And I'm using my pick and stick tool from Gina K Designs and some liquid glue to attach those. And then that's going to finish off my card project for you today using a couple of the new sets of fresh dye inks from Altenew. I hope you enjoyed today's card. Thanks so much for joining.